One of America's closest allies is quietly rewiring its trade routes, not with oil or gas, but with aluminium. For decades, the US bought the vast majority of Canada's aluminium, sometimes over 80% of it. But in 2025, something shifted. An $18 billion pivot towards Europe began to take shape, and this time the advantage isn't geography, it's carbon. Today, we're looking at how carbon pricing rules, not tariffs, not shipping lanes, are starting to redraw the aluminium trade map. We'll see why Canada's low-carbon smelters are suddenly Europe's dream suppliers, and why that shift matters far beyond the metal market. We'll start with the old arrangement, how Canada became the USA's aluminium gas station. Then we'll break down the carbon advantage and why it's basically a tariff shield. And finally, we'll look at how this small shift in trade flows could quietly reshape US-Canada relations. Quick question before we start, just for fun. Are you in the aluminium or the aluminum club? Drop your preferences in the comments and I'll tell you mine towards the end. So, Canada's aluminium industry is built for export. 10 million smelters in Quebec and British Columbia produce over 3 million tons a year, which is about 11% of global aluminium exports. For most of modern trade history, the US has been the natural destination. The geography is a gift. Canadian smelters sit within easy rail or shipping distance of US manufacturing hubs. The market is huge, the political relationships are relatively stable, and until recently, there weren't many better options. But there is a catch. Whenever US-Canada relations sour, whether it's over dairy quotas or broader trade spats, aluminium becomes a target. In 2018, Washington slapped a 10% tariff on Canadian aluminium under national security grounds. The move was temporary, but it was a wake-up call. Relying on one buyer gives the buyer leverage. For decades, that was a manageable risk. Now, climate policy is changing the math entirely. Enter the EU Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanisms, CBAM. Starting in 2026, Europe will begin imposing carbon tariffs on certain imported goods, including aluminium, based on how much CO2 was emitted in making them. Most aluminium in the world is smelted using coal-fired electricity in China, India, parts of the Middle East. Producing 1 ton of that aluminium can emit 16 tons of CO2. Not that great. Canada's smelters are almost entirely powered by hydroelectricity. A smelter is basically like a giant kitchen for metal. It cooks aluminium oxide at extremely high temperatures until it melts into pure aluminium. Man, I wish I was a chemist. This process normally uses enormous amounts of electricity, and if that electricity comes from coal or gas, the carbon emissions skyrocket. That means their emissions are roughly 2.2 tons of CO2 per ton of aluminium, about 1/7 of the global average. That difference isn't just green bragging rights, it's literal money. Under CBAM, a coal-based producer exporting to Europe could face carbon tariffs adding hundreds of dollars per ton, in some cases over $300 depending on the EU carbon price. Canada's hydropowered smelters are essentially tariff-proof, and in some cases their product sells at a premium, which is a very rare case where climate credentials directly translate into market power. It's also a sharp contrast to what is happening south of the border. In 2025, you all have heard of this, Trump has been escalating Section 232 tariffs on Canadian aluminium from 25% in March to 50% by June, while also imposing 35% tariffs on most other Canadian goods under a separate July executive order. Ottawa has hit back with 25% retaliatory tariffs on the US aluminium and other products. And this back and forth has turned the Canada-US aluminium trade from a century-old habit into a political hostage situation. And that is where Europe comes in. CBAM gives Canada a way to play offense, not just defense. Instead of fighting to keep every ton flowing south under unpredictable tariff threats, Canadian producers can lock in long-term European contracts that pay more and can't be undone by a single presidential signature. This flips a century of trade logic. Geography used to be king, I suppose it still is in some cases. Ship to the nearest biggest market, no questions asked. Now compliance with environmental rules can outweigh shipping costs, and in a world where US-Canada trade can be weaponized overnight, climate policy is more than a virtue signal. It is actually a shield. Germany is actually a perfect example of how this plays out. The country is overhauling its industrial base, from car manufacturing to green construction to meet net zero targets. Aluminium is critical in lighter, more fuel-efficient vehicles, renewable energy infrastructure, and low-carbon building materials. But sourcing aluminium without a carbon penalty is very tricky. Russia was once a major supplier to Europe, but sanctions have choked off that pipeline. China's product comes with heavy emissions and political baggage. Now, here's where it gets very interesting. European buyers aren't just looking at price anymore. They're calculating the total cost of carbon. When you factor in CBAM tariffs on high-emission aluminium, suddenly the cheaper Chinese product isn't looking so affordable. German procurement teams are running the numbers, and the math is starting to favor cleaner alternatives, even if the upfront price is a little higher. This shift is creating opportunities that didn't exist just a few years ago. Traditional trade relationships built purely on costs are being reshuffled as carbon accounting becomes a real business factor. For countries like Germany, this isn't just about environmental goals. It's about maintaining industrial competitiveness in a world where carbon costs are becoming unavoidable. Enter Canada, CBAM ready, politically safe, hydropowered. By mid-2025, Canada's aluminium exports to Germany had climbed steadily, with early test shipments also landing in the Netherlands, Poland, and Denmark, the kind of cautious orders that often turn into multi-year contracts. Germany's automakers, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, can integrate Canadian aluminium without CBAM tariffs, keeping their supply chains competitive. And for Canada, every ton sold to Europe is a ton not automatically earmarked for the US. So let's put all of this into perspective. In the first half of 2025, Canadian aluminium exports to the EU rose over 12% year on year. That's still small in absolute terms. Europe takes less than 10% of Canada's total aluminium exports. But here's where it gets really interesting. In 2010, the US bought 85% of Canada's aluminium exports. By mid-2025, that share was under 70% and falling. Even nudging Europe's share from 3% to 6% could mean hundreds of millions of dollars in extra annual revenue for Canadian producers. That's because low-carbon aluminium often sells at $150 to $200 per ton premium, a price signal driven directly by climate policy. If you want to support this kind of analysis where we dig into politics hiding inside trade stats, there's a Ko-fi link below. Every contribution helps because these videos do take forever to make. Anyway, for the US, this isn't just about metal. Aluminium is a strategic material. It's essential for power grids, aircraft frames, satellites, military vehicles. But American smelter capacity has been shrinking for a decade, down about 15% since 2015, which makes the US more reliant on imports than ever before. The Trump administration turbocharged this dependency. In March 2025, Trump reimposed 25% tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminium under Section 232, applying to raw, semi-processed, and derivative products. In June, he doubled those tariffs to 50%. Fast forward to August now, and he raised general tariffs on non-USMCA goods from Canada to 35%, hitting aluminium among other sectors too. These repeated moves drove a sharp wedge between the US and Canada, both signaling that even reliable suppliers can become political bargaining chips overnight. That realization stings more than any shipment delay, honestly. For Canada, diversifying its buyers is now a form of trade insurance. The 2018 tariff scare almost showed how politics can weaponize commerce. With Europe's CBAM in play, Canadian aluminium isn't just a backup, it is a resilient long-term market offering high margins and relative immunity to snap US trade warfare. And this is a part of a broader trend as well. Climate policy is becoming as important as geography in determining trade routes. We've seen similar dynamics as steel, cement, and even fertilizers. Once CBAM is fully operational, more industries will feel it. Countries that can produce low-carbon versions of heavy industrial goods will enjoy built-in tariff protection and often a price premium. For allies, this creates a new kind of relationship. It's not about who's closest or even who is friendliest. It's about who can deliver the cleanest product under the new rules. And that's a completely different kind of loyalty. If projections hold, Europe's demand for low-carbon aluminium will rise 15 to 20% by 2030. Canada's hydro advantage means it can claim a meaningful slice of that market. And while $18 billion in trade may not seem massive compared to oil or cars, in a niche industry like aluminium, it is tectonic. If you're enjoying this breakdown, I'd love it if you subscribed. I'm aiming for 10,000 by Christmas. Anyway, this $18 billion aluminium shift isn't about abandoning the US, it's about ending dependence on any single buyer. And it's a reminder that in the 21st century economy, loyalty has a shelf life. The countries that adapt fastest to new rules often get to ride them, and right now, Canada is moving faster than most expected. Washington is learning that even long-standing trade relationships can melt away, quietly and without much fanfare. Oh, and that question from earlier? I'm in the aluminium club. I mean, I am European after all. If you want to see how these climate-driven trade rules are reshaping global power far beyond aluminium, including who might lead the world by 2040, watch this video that I'm linking here, exploring whether America's reign is ending and who will rule the world in 2040, because aluminium may just be the start. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.